Welcome back to Bay Area Focus. Earlier this month, I spoke with Dan Flanagan, an expert on Operation Babylift. Dan told us how the special operation brought thousands of Vietnamese orphans to the Bay Area in 1975. All right, so let's start with 1975, right. April. What was going on then?
Well, in terms of the Vietnam War, Michelle, Da Nang had just fallen in that first week in April. The North Vietnamese, despite the peace agreements back in '73, it was pretty clear that Vietnam ultimately was going to fall. And there was great trepidation throughout South Vietnam. And so Ed Daly, his daughter Charlotte, was very involved in adoption work. And she encouraged her father to bring his world, he was the owner of World Airways, to launch the first aircraft bringing infants back to the United States. And he was picking them up in Da Nang, which is up in the north, and also down in Saigon at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. I spent quite a bit of over a year and a half in Vietnam.
You were in the Navy? Yeah,
I was in the Navy. I was a Naval Academy grad. I knew the country really well, and I sort of identified with all this.
So around that time, the North Vietnamese Army, they were moving down south, and the orphanages there in Vietnam, they were getting nervous about...
That's correct, and primarily in Saigon. And so Ed Daly began the first flights, and then on April 3rd, President Ford, who was a sort of quasi-orphan himself, signed Operation Babylift 40 years ago.
40 years ago, April
1st. To authorize payment for flights to start bringing the babies out and make it an official U.S. policy.
And dozens of flights.
There were dozens of flights.
Came to the U.S., 2,600 orphans to the U.S.?
That's correct. And most of them actually came to San Francisco, Travis Air Force Base or San Francisco. Sure. In the case of when President Ford flew up on Air Force One, he met one of those flights.
And when the orphans did arrive in San Francisco, KPIX-5 was actually there, and we have footage. We have footage from that.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that.
Never seen quite the cooperation that we had here tonight. The customs people with their very demanding job, the immigration people, everybody have just bent over backwards to make way for these kids and to make us able to cover it for you. I am right at the foot of the stairway now, and you can probably see that little one who just came down. The people going up, again, are the blanket brigade. They're taking up blankets, they wrap a child in it, and bring them down.
Mm-hmm. To your knowledge, are we the only people broadcasting this live, or are there other live facilities there?
No, we are the only ones bringing it live, Stan, as we usually do on many news occasions. We will, of course, have complete film reports. We're filming a lot of things now, a lot of interviews. There are a lot of people who have a lot to say. We chose at this time live to let you see the children rather than a lot of people talking, but we are filming all of those, and tomorrow, of course, on the news at 6, 7, and 11, we'll be able to recap the story completely for you.
And again, that was from 1975. They said the Blanket Brigade,
right. And
many of them were volunteers.
I was there, and the line of buses, they were military buses, Army buses that went down. There were about 40 buses. And the volunteers, what happened is I was asked to go out and run this in terms of the volunteers. I mean, we had the doctors, the Army, but we needed volunteers. We needed laps. And so every morning, every evening, I would brief the press and how many volunteers we would need. And you'd be amazed, the hundreds and hundreds of women primarily who would be lined up on a Mason Street there by Chrissy Field going out into Marina Boulevard. And they would board these buses, as they did going down to for that particular arrival, and wait. And then as the babies were brought off the plane, each baby was embraced by one of those volunteers. And then the buses proceeded back to the Presidio to Harmon Hall, Building 694. It was an old Army Reserve Center. And
about 1,500 were processed there.
1,318 precisely, and there were roughly over 15 flights that we took care of.
I noticed when we were watching that clip, you got emotional. It still hits you 40 years later?
Well, I'm Irish, and I tend to get a little emotional. But it's a very memorable thing. I've never forgotten about it. And there were some fantastic exhibitions. You see, the Vietnam War in San Francisco was a very difficult time. And here was something positive. Here was something that people could do that was, was different. And they really turned out. And it was really remarkable. Now, how we delivered those babies, because the whole point was they had arrived in the United States. So we called this Orphans Airlift at the Presidio. And it was an Army name, the doctors, everybody. We had an organizational chart, et cetera, et cetera. It was very ad hoc. But we ended up delivering those babies to their adopting parents all over the country, and most of them were in the adoption process, in the pipeline. Many were not, but most of them were. And so these brand of stewardesses called me from Dallas, and with that charming southern Texas accent, and they flew up, and they manned the desk, and they coordinated stewardesses, and I've talked to some of those stewardesses. I have not been able to find the group that came up initially and coordinated, but they came up, and each baby was delivered around the country by these stewardesses. And they're really one of the heroes or heroines of that story. I talked to a congressman from Cape Cod, Congressman Dillahunt, back 15 years ago, because he had adopted one of these. And I said, what was it like at the receiving end? He said, Dan, they called me. I went up to Logan Airport, and a stewardess came off the plane and gave me the baby. And at one point at Harmon Hall, where this all took place, and the exhibit has a picture of that out at the Presidio and the old Officers Club, which has been remodeled. It's really terrific. In the exhibit for Operation Babylift / Orphans Airlift. Harmon Hall, at one point, it was just mattresses, et cetera, and up on the stage were the doctors giving instructions and whatnot. And we had over 300 babies at one point in that building, and we had to get them out. It was just, you couldn't do it. No, there were a lot of babies that were in the different obstetric wards around the Bay Area. We had all of the hospitals at max, and we kept delivering them and delivering them. Only one baby died at Mount Zion in the whole episode, which is remarkable.
Sure. Yeah, because some of the babies came, they needed medical care, but this was really a joint effort. You had the flight attendants that you talked about, and nurses and volunteers and people like you who came out to help. And thank goodness it is so memorable. And not a lot of people know about this, but luckily there's an exhibit going on right now.
Yeah, I would recommend people go out. They've totally remodeled the old Officers Club. It's a wonderful exhibit hall now, and there are some really interesting things about what occurred there at Orphans Airlift. You know, there's not very little military now here in the Bay Area, and here's something that people should go out and see.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you. For information on the Operation Babylift exhibit, log on to presidioofficersclub.com. Again, that's presidioofficersclub.com. And for an in-depth look at Operation Babylift, don't miss Flight from Saigon, which airs at 9:30 this morning on KPIX. And coming up, how one nonprofit gets children and their parents reading together.